in the heart of the Frozen Kingdom, where ice glistens like diamonds under a pale winter sun, a young ice sculptor named Ellara stumbles upon something extraordinary. Deep within a glacier, her chisel strikes not ice, but an ancient shard, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. As her fingers brush against its surface, her mind is flooded with visions of a forgotten winter deity, a prophecy of doom, and a chilling truth. The eternal winter that blankets her kingdom is no blessing, but a curse. One that will soon consume all life unless she acts. Now, Alara stands at a crossroads. Does she turn away, leaving her people to their fate? Or does she step into the unknown, risking everything to unravel the mysteries of the Frozen Kingdom? The choice is hers, and the stakes could not be higher. What follows is a tale of courage, sacrifice, and the power of one person to change the course of destiny. This is the story of Alara and the journey that will define her and her world forever. Alara stood at the edge of the village, her breath forming tiny clouds in the frosty air. The weight of her vision pressed heavily on her chest, a secret too vast to bear alone. She turned to Kale, her oldest friend, whose sharp eyes and steady presence had always been a source of comfort. Kale, a tracker known for his uncanny ability to navigate even the most treacherous terrains, listened intently as Alara recounted the swirling images of the Frozen King and the cryptic warning that had haunted her dreams. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this," Ellara admitted, her voice trembling. "What if I'm not strong enough? What if I fail?" Kale placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his grip firm yet gentle. "You've always been stronger than you think, Ellara, and you're not alone. We'll face this together." His words were a balm to her frayed nerves, but the doubt lingered, a shadow she couldn't shake. Their plan was clear: seek out the frost sages, ancient beings said to hold the kingdom's oldest secrets. The sages were elusive, their sanctuary hidden deep within the icy wilderness, but if anyone could help decipher the vision, it was them. As they packed supplies for the journey, Alara's hands fumbled with the straps of her bag, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Kale, ever practical, moved with purpose, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to her unease. The first leg of their journey was uneventful, the snow-covered landscape stretching endlessly before them. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky darkened and the wind began to howl. A blizzard descended with terrifying speed, its icy claws tearing at their cloaks and obscuring the path ahead. Kale shouted over the roar of the storm, urging Alara to follow him as they sought shelter. Through the blinding snow, they stumbled upon a cavern, its entrance half buried in ice and snowdrifts. Inside, the cavern was eerily still, the storm's fury muffled by its thick walls. Ellara shivered, not just from the cold, but from the weight of the moment. "Do you think the sages will even help us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kale crouched by a small fire he'd managed to light, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. "They'll help," he said firmly, "but first, we need to survive this storm." "And we will." As the fire crackled, the tension between them ebbed, replaced by the quiet understanding that had always defined their friendship. Yet the journey ahead loomed large, a test not just of their endurance, but of their trust in one another. The blizzard raged on outside, but within the cavern, a fragile hope began to take root, fragile yet unyielding, like the first light of dawn breaking through the longest night. The air inside the cavern was sharp with cold, each breath hanging like a ghostly mist in the dim light. Elara's fingers traced the rough surface of the ancient carvings etched into the walls, their deep grooves telling stories of a time long forgotten. The figures of a towering winter deity loomed above, their icy gaze seeming to pierce through the centuries. Beside them, scenes of a ritual unfolded, a ritual meant to restore balance to a kingdom on the brink of collapse. Kale knelt nearby, his brow furrowed as he studied the symbols. "These carvings, they're instructions," he said, his voice low but urgent, "but they're incomplete. We'll need to piece this together if we're going to understand what they are asking of us." Before they could delve deeper, a low growl echoed through the cavern, sending a shiver down their spines. From the shadows emerged a pack of frost wolves, their fur like shards of ice, their eyes glowing with a predatory hunger. Elara's heart raced as she reached for her satchel, her hand closing around the familiar weight of her sculpting tools. Without thinking, she began to shape the air itself, her movements swift and precise. The shard at her side pulsed with a faint blue light, and suddenly, a wall of ice erupted from the ground, shielding them from the wolves' first lunge. Kale drew his blade, his movements steady despite the chaos. The wolves circled, their growls growing louder, but Elara's ice barriers held firm, giving them a momentary advantage. She could feel the shard's energy coursing through her, a strange but exhilarating connection she hadn't felt before. It was as if the shard and her tools were working in unison, amplifying her abilities in ways she hadn't imagined possible. "I can hold them off," she called to Kale, her voice edged with determination, but the pack was relentless. One wolf broke through, its claws slashing at Kale before he could react. He stumbled back, clutching his side as crimson bloomed against the white of his tunic. Elara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to rush to him, but the wolves were still closing in, their snarls filling the cavern. With a surge of focus, she summoned another barrier, this one sharper and taller, forcing the wolves to retreat into the shadows. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of Kale's labored breathing. Elara knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she assessed the wound. "It's not deep," he assured her, though his face was pale, "but we need to move quickly. If they come back," his words trailed off, but the unspoken warning hung heavy in the air. Elara's mind raced. The carvings held the key to saving the kingdom, but Kael was hurt, and the wolves were still out there. Could they risk pressing forward, or was it safer to retreat and regroup? She glanced at the shard, its light flickering faintly, as if urging her to make a choice. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, but deep down, she knew what she had to do. The kingdom's fate, and perhaps their own, depended on it. With a steadying breath, she helped Kael to his feet, her resolve hardening. "We'll take it slow," she said, her voice firm. "But we're not turning back, not yet." The shard's light seemed to grow stronger, a silent affirmation of her choice. Together, they pressed deeper into the cavern, the carving's secrets waiting to be unraveled. Elara's resolve burned brighter than the icy winds that howled around them. With the shard's pulsating energy cradled in her hands, she knelt beside Kael, whose breaths came shallow and labored. The glow of the shard intensified as she focused its power, weaving threads of warmth and light into his battered body. Slowly, the color returned to his cheeks, and his wounds began to close. Kael's eyes fluttered open, gratitude and concern mingling in his gaze. But Alara knew this was only the beginning. The Shards' energy was a double-edged sword, and each use came at a cost. Pressing forward, the duo ventured deeper into the frozen wilderness, where the air grew thinner and the snow seemed to whisper ancient secrets. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon a nomadic tribe, their tents crafted from shimmering ice and their faces etched with the wisdom of centuries. The tribe's leader, a woman with eyes as sharp as frost-kissed steel, stepped forward to greet them. Her voice carried both warmth and warning as she spoke of the frost sages, elusive guardians who tested all who sought their aid. "Their trials are not for the faint of heart," she said, her tone grave. "Many have ventured into their domain, but few have returned." In a gesture of reluctant generosity, the leader offered them a map, a fragile parchment marked with cryptic symbols that pointed the way to the frost sage's sanctuary. But there was a condition. Ellara would need to prove her worth by carving a sacred ice totem, a task that demanded not only skill, but also a deep connection to the land's ancient magic. With a steady hand and a heart full of determination, Ellara set to work. The ice seemed to hum beneath her fingers as she shaped it, her movements guided by an unseen force. As the totem took form, its intricate patterns glowing with an otherworldly light, the tribe watched in silent awe, but the effort left Ellara drained, her body trembling as the Shard's energy pulsed faintly in her grasp. The more she relied on its power, the more it seemed to entwine itself with her very essence, a subtle but insidious presence that whispered promises of strength at a price. Kael's hand found hers, his grip firm and reassuring, but even his steadfastness couldn't dispel the unease that settled over her. The trials ahead would test not only their courage, but also their ability to resist the Shard's growing influence. And as the wind carried the echoes of the tribe's farewell, Ellara couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest choices were yet to come. Ellara and Kale stood before the Frost Sage's sanctuary, a colossal fortress of ice that pierced the sky, its walls shimmering like a mirage in the pale winter light. Surrounding it were swirling sentient snowstorms, their howls echoing with a strange, almost mournful tone. The air was thick with magic, heavy and ancient, as if the fortress itself were alive and watching them. To enter, they would need more than strength. They would need wisdom. A deep, resonant voice emerged from the storm, challenging them with a riddle that spoke of balance and sacrifice. What is given freely yet demands a price? What is lost in offering but gained in purpose? Ellara, though weary and trembling from the Shard's draining power, stepped forward. Her fingers brushed the glowing fragment at her side, and without hesitation, she broke off a small piece, holding it out to the storm. The wind stilled, and the fortress gates groaned open, but the cost was steep. Her strength faltered, her breath shallow, as the Shard's energy flickered dimly within her. Inside, the sanctuary was a cathedral of ice, its walls carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change as they walked. The Frost Sages awaited them, their forms barely distinguishable from the ice itself, their voices a chorus of whispers that filled the vast chamber. They spoke of the Shard's true nature, a fragment of the heart of the winter deity, once a source of life, and renewal for the kingdom. But now, corrupted by an ancient betrayal, its power twisted the land into an unending winter, feeding on the despair of those who suffered under its weight. The sages warned that the Shards' corruption would only grow stronger, consuming Ellara if she continued to bear it. Yet, they also hinted at a path to redemption, one that would require not just courage, but a profound understanding of the balance between life and loss. As Alara absorbed their words, a quiet resolve settled over her, even as her body trembled under the Shards' growing burden. Kale, ever vigilant at her side, tightened his grip on his staff, his eyes reflecting the gravity of their mission. The sanctuary's icy walls seemed to close in, their journey now more perilous than ever, but the truth they had uncovered was a glimmer of hope in the darkness. The sage's words lingered in the cold air like frost, heavy with both promise and peril. Ellara stood before them, the weight of their revelation pressing down on her shoulders. The shards of the deity's heart were scattered across the kingdom, each one a fragment of immense power and danger. To restore the heart and end the eternal winter, she would have to seek them out, one by one. But the sages warned her that each shard would test her resolve, tempting her with its raw, untamed energy. Could she resist their allure, or would the very power she sought to harness consume her? Kale stepped forward, his voice steady but laced with determination. "You're not doing this alone. I'm coming with you." Elara's heart clenched at his words. She had seen the cost of bravery too many times before the way it could shatter lives in an instant. "No," she said firmly, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "This is my burden to carry. I won't risk your life too." Kale's eyes narrowed, his stubbornness matching hers. "You don't get to decide that. This isn't just your fight. It's all of ours. And if you think I'm going to let you face this alone, you're wrong." Their voices rose, echoing through the icy chamber. But before their argument could escalate, the ground beneath them shuddered violently. A deafening roar filled the air as the mountainside above them gave way, sending a wall of snow and ice crashing down. Instinct took over. Ellara grabbed Kale's arm, pulling him into the shelter of a nearby overhang as the avalanche thundered past, burying everything in its path. The world became a blur of white and noise, and for a moment, it felt as though the mountain itself was alive, intent on swallowing them whole. When the chaos finally subsided, the two of them stood in stunned silence, the reality of their situation sinking in. The path ahead was blocked, the way back impassable. There was no choice but to move forward together. Alara glanced at Kale, her fear for his safety warring with the undeniable truth that they were stronger as a team. "Fine," she said reluctantly, her breath visible in the frigid air. "But if we're doing this, we do it my way. No reckless moves, no unnecessary risks." Kale nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Deal, but don't think for a second that means I'll let you take all the glory." The avalanche had been a stark reminder of the dangers they faced, but it also forced them to confront their shared purpose. As they began to dig their way out, the tension between them eased, replaced by a quiet determination. The journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, and the shards would test not only their strength, but their trust in each other. For now, though, they had survived the first trial, and that was enough. The frozen lake stretched before them, its surface a mirror of jagged ice and swirling mist. Ellara and Kale stood at its edge, their breaths visible in the cold air. Beneath the icy veneer, a faint, pulsating glow hinted at the second shard's resting place. But it wasn't unguarded. A massive ice serpent, its scales shimmering like fractured glass, coiled beneath the surface, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The creature was ancient, a guardian bound to the shard by forces neither of them fully understood. Alara crouched low, her fingers brushing the frost-covered ground. She closed her eyes, focusing her energy, and began to mold the snow and ice around her. With swift, precise movements, she shaped a lifelike decoy of herself, its features so detailed it could fool even the sharpest of eyes. Kael watched in awe, his admiration for her skill momentarily eclipsing the tension of the moment. When the sculpture was complete, Ellara placed it near the water's edge, its presence drawing the serpent's attention like a moth to flame. As the serpent lunged toward the decoy, Kael seized his chance. He moved swiftly, his boots crunching softly against the ice as he approached the glowing shard embedded deep within the frozen lake. Reaching out, he grasped it, and the moment his fingers closed around it, a surge of energy coursed through him. His eyes widened, their usual warmth replaced by a strange, flickering light. The shard's power was intoxicating, overwhelming, and it began to twist his thoughts, clouding his judgment. Ellara noticed the change immediately. Kael's movements became erratic, his voice tinged with a sharp, unfamiliar edge. He clutched the shard tightly, refusing to let go, his gaze darting around as if he no longer trusted her. The serpent, now realizing the ruse, turned its attention back to them, its massive body coiling for another strike. Elara's heart raced. She had to act quickly, but her options were fraught with danger. If she took the shard from Kael, she risked fracturing their friendship, a bond that had carried them through countless trials. But if she left it in his hands, the shard's corrupting energy could lead them both to ruin. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her. She stepped closer, her voice calm but firm, trying to reach the Kael she knew. "We need to work together," she urged, her words cutting through the icy air. "This thing is changing you. Let me help." Kael hesitated, his grip on the shard tightening and loosening in quick succession. The serpent's shadow loomed closer, its jaws parting to reveal rows of jagged teeth. Time was slipping away, and Alara knew she couldn't wait any longer. With a deep breath, she reached for the shard, her fingers brushing against his. The moment stretched, charged with uncertainty, as both the serpent's roar and the shard's hum filled the air. Ellara stood before Kael, her voice steady but her hands trembling as she reached for the shard. "We can't risk it falling into the wrong hands," she said, her gaze locked on his. "Trust me, Kael, this is the only way." Reluctantly, he handed it over, his fingers brushing hers for a moment too long, as if he already sensed the rift forming between them. The shard pulsed faintly in her palm, a cold, metallic thrum that seemed to echo the growing unease in her chest. As they pressed onward through the snow-laden forest, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like the rustle of leaves in the wind, but soon they grew louder, more insistent. Visions flickered at the edges of Alara's mind, images of herself, standing atop the frozen throne, the shard glowing brighter than the sun, her will bending the world to her command. Power, control, the very things she had always feared now felt tantalizingly close, as if they were hers for the taking. She shook her head, trying to clear the thoughts, but the shard's pull was relentless. What if restoring the deity's heart wasn't the answer? What if it only unleashed something far worse? The weight of the decision pressed down on her, and she found herself slowing her steps, her mind racing. Kale glanced back, his sharp eyes catching her hesitation. "Ellara," he said, his voice firm but tinged with concern. "We can't afford to doubt now. The shard, it's playing with your mind." She nodded, but the words felt hollow. Their trust, once unshakable, now felt like a fragile thread stretched too thin. Kale's insistence only deepened her unease, as if he couldn't, or wouldn't, understand the turmoil inside her. The shard's whispers grew louder, a siren song that drowned out his voice, and with each step, the distance between them seemed to widen, not in miles, but in something far more irreparable. As Alara and Kale stepped into the cursed village, a heavy stillness hung in the air, broken only by the faint crunch of snow beneath their boots. The homes were shrouded in frost, their windows glazed with ice, and the villagers stood frozen in place, mid-step, mid-conversation, as though time itself had been paused. A faint blue glow emanated from the heart of the village, pulsating softly, a sign that the third shard was close. But this shard was no ordinary treasure. It was the source of the curse, its energy binding the villagers in an endless winter sleep. Ellara hesitated, her breath visible in the cold air. Taking the shard would mean breaking the curse's hold, but at a terrible cost. Without its energy, the villagers might never wake, their lives forever suspended in this icy limbo. Yet leaving it behind would doom the Frozen Kingdom to collapse, its fate sealed by her failure. The weight of the decision pressed on her chest, each option a shadow darker than the last. Kale, ever observant, broke the silence. "There has to be another way," he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "We can't just leave them like this, but the kingdom depends on us." His words echoed her own thoughts, and Elara's mind raced, searching for a solution. Then, an idea sparked, a fragile hope born from her unique gift. Elara's sculpting skills had always been her strength, her ability to shape ice into intricate forms, to breathe life into frozen creations. What if she could use that same skill here? She could craft a temporary barrier, a shield of ice infused with her own energy, to sustain the village long enough for them to retrieve the shard without dooming its inhabitants. The plan was daring, untested, and fraught with risk, but it was the only way. Alara knelt in the snow, her hands trembling as she began to sculpt. With each careful movement, she poured her focus into the ice, shaping it into a delicate latticework of frost. The air around her seemed to hum with energy as the barrier took form, its crystalline structure shimmering faintly in the dim light. As the final piece fell into place, Alara stood, her heart pounding. The barrier pulsed with a soft, steady glow, a fragile lifeline for the village. She turned to Kale, her resolve firm. "It's ready," she said, "but we have to move quickly. This won't hold forever." With the temporary barrier in place, they approached the shard, its icy light growing brighter as they drew near. Ellara reached out, her fingers brushing against its surface, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The shard came free, its energy shifting, and the village trembled, but the barrier held, its glow flickering faintly. They had done it. The shard was theirs, and the villagers remained unharmed, their slumber preserved by Elara's quick thinking and skill. Yet as they left the village behind, the weight of their journey felt heavier than ever. Each step brought them closer to the Frozen Kingdom's salvation, but the cost of their choices loomed large, a reminder of the delicate balance between sacrifice and hope. As Alara and Kale stepped beyond the village, the air seemed to grow colder, sharper, as if the elements themselves were responding to her presence. The shards hummed softly against her chest, their icy resonance deepening with every step. She could feel it now, a strange magnetic pull, as though the shards were not just fragments of power, but extensions of her very being. With a tentative breath, she lifted her hand, and a swirl of snow danced at her fingertips, twisting and spiraling at her command. It was exhilarating, a rush of energy she had never known, but as the snowflakes settled, she noticed something unsettling. Her hands, once warm and steady, were now pale, almost translucent, as if frost were creeping beneath her skin. She clenched her fists, trying to ignore the chill, but the cold was spreading, a reminder that this power was not without its price. Kale watched her closely, his brow furrowed with concern. He had seen the way her emotions seemed to shift like the wind, one moment calm, the next stormy. "Ellara," he said softly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "This power, it's changing you. We need to be careful." She turned to him, her eyes glinting with a mix of determination and frustration. "I know what I'm doing," she insisted, though her voice wavered slightly. "We can't stop now. The Frozen Kingdom depends on us." Kale hesitated, his gaze lingering on her trembling hands, but he nodded reluctantly. He had always trusted her judgment, even when the path ahead seemed uncertain. Their journey led them higher into the mountains, where the air grew thin and the ground crunched beneath their boots. The landscape was both beautiful and unforgiving, a vast expanse of white broken only by jagged peaks and frozen streams. But as they approached a narrow mountain pass, the sky darkened and the wind began to howl. What started as a gentle snowfall quickly turned into a blinding storm, the kind that could swallow travelers whole. Ice crystals stung their faces, and the path ahead became a blur of white. Alara clenched her teeth, her connection to the shards flaring as she tried to shield them from the storm. But the power felt wild, untamed, and the more she fought to control it, the more it seemed to slip through her grasp. Kale reached for her, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We need to find shelter now." Ellara nodded, her breath coming in short, visible puffs. The storm was relentless, a force of nature that seemed to test their resolve. But even as the cold bit at her skin and the weight of the shards pressed heavily on her chest, she knew they couldn't turn back. Somewhere beyond the storm lay the heart of the Frozen Kingdom, and with it, the answers they so desperately sought. Together, they pressed on, each step a battle against the elements, their bond the only warmth in a world of ice. The howling winds of the ice storm tore through the frozen landscape, a relentless force that seemed to have a mind of its own. Ellara shielded her face with her cloak, her breath crystallizing in the air as she called out for Kale, but her voice was swallowed by the storm, and the distance between them grew with each passing moment. Alone now, she felt the weight of her mission pressing down on her. The shards, the prophecy, the fate of the Frozen Kingdom, resting on her shoulders. Yet as the cold bit deeper, something stirred within her. A warmth, faint but undeniable, pulsed through her veins. Her newfound powers, still raw and untamed, began to awaken, responding to the storm's fury. She could feel the ice around her, not as an enemy, but as something she could shape, something she could command. As the storm raged on, a figure emerged from the swirling snow. Cloaked in frost-touched robes, they moved with an eerie grace, untouched by the chaos around them. Their voice, when it came, was calm and measured, cutting through the wind like a blade. "You seek the final shard," they said, their eyes glinting like shards of ice in the dim light. "I am a servant of the winter deity, and I offer you guidance." Elara's heart raced. Could this be the help she desperately needed, or was it a trap, a trick of the storm itself? The figure extended a hand, their palm glowing faintly with a pale blue light. "But know this," they continued, their tone grave. "To restore the deity's heart, a great sacrifice will be required. The path I offer is not without cost." Alara hesitated, her mind racing. Trust was a fragile thing, especially in a land where shadows whispered and the cold seemed to conspire against her. She thought of Kale, of the promises they had made to each other, and of the kingdom that depended on their success. The stranger's words echoed in her mind: sacrifice. What would it mean? What would it demand of her? She glanced at the storm, at the endless expanse of white and ice, and then back at the figure. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. The figure tilted their head, their expression unreadable. "Because," they said simply, "you have no other choice." The truth of those words settled over her like a heavy blanket. She could forge ahead alone, relying on her instincts and her fledgling powers, or she could take the hand of this mysterious guide and risk whatever price the journey demanded. The ice beneath her feet seemed to hum, as if the frozen kingdom itself were waiting for her decision. Ellara closed her eyes, feeling the pulse of her powers, the faint warmth that defied the cold. She had come this far, not by chance, but by her own will, and yet the thought of facing the unknown alone sent a shiver down her spine. She opened her eyes, her gaze locking with the figures. "Lead the way," she said, her voice firm, but even as she spoke, a part of her wondered if she had just stepped onto a path from which there was no turning back. Ellara hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, her breath visible in the icy air as she followed the stranger into the shadowed depths of the mountain. The path twisted and turned, the walls glistening with frost, until they reached a massive stone archway carved with ancient runes. Beyond it lay the hidden temple, its grandeur untouched by time. The air inside was heavy with a strange energy, a hum that seemed to resonate deep within her chest. Her eyes were drawn to the center of the chamber, where a single shard of ice glowed with an otherworldly light, the final piece of the frozen crown. As she approached, the temperature dropped sharply, and a figure materialized before her, towering and ethereal. It was the winter deity, its form shifting like a blizzard, its voice echoing with the power of 1,000 storms. "Ellara," it intoned, "you have proven yourself worthy. Take the shard, and with it, the power to rule this kingdom. Bend the frost to your will, and command the loyalty of all who dwell here. You need not return to the life you left behind. The offer was tempting, almost intoxicating. She could feel the weight of the Shards' power calling to her, promising an end to her struggles and a throne where she would never again feel powerless. But then, like a flicker of warmth in the frozen air, the prophecy came back to her. The sacrifices she had made, the friends who had stood by her, the kingdom that depended on her choices, they all reminded her of what truly mattered. "I cannot," she said, her voice steady despite the chill that gripped her. "This power was never meant for one person to wield. The frozen crown belongs to the land, to the people, not to me." The deity's form darkened, the air crackling with icy fury. "You dare refuse me," it roared, its voice shaking the temple walls. Before Ellara could respond, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and the ceiling above started to splinter. The temple was collapsing, the deity's wrath unleashing chaos. Without thinking, she grabbed the shard and turned to run, her heart pounding as the walls crumbled around her. The stranger was gone, leaving her to navigate the crumbling labyrinth alone. Rocks and ice fell in her path, but she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that the shard was now her responsibility. The prophecy had warned of this moment, of the danger that would come with the final piece, and as she sprinted through the collapsing temple, Alara realized that her true test was only just beginning. The air was thick with dust, and the distant rumble of falling stone as Alara stumbled out of the collapsing temple, the final shard clutched tightly in her trembling hands. Her heart raced, not just from the danger she had barely escaped, but from the weight of what she now carried. The shard pulsed faintly, its icy light casting eerie shadows across her face. She paused, catching her breath, and glanced back at the crumbling entrance. The temple, once a sanctuary of ancient power, was now a tomb for the secrets it had guarded for centuries. As she stepped into the cold night, a familiar voice broke through the silence. "Ellara." Kale emerged from the shadows, his expression a mix of relief and urgency. His cloak was dusted with snow, and his breath came in visible puffs as he hurried toward her. "I've been searching everywhere. When the temple started to collapse, I thought." He stopped himself, his eyes narrowing as he took in her disheveled appearance and the shard in her grasp. "You found it," he said, his voice softening. She nodded, her grip tightening around the shard. "But it wasn't without cost," she whispered, her gaze distant. The memory of what she had seen, what she had felt, in that final chamber lingered, a haunting reminder of the stakes they faced. Kale placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, grounding her in the present. "We need to get back to the Frost Sages," he said firmly. "They'll know what to do next." The journey back to the Frost Sages was a blur of snow and silence. Elara's mind raced, replaying the events in the temple and the ominous whispers that had echoed in its halls. When they finally reached the sanctuary of the sages, the ancient figures were already waiting, their faces solemn. The shard was placed among the others, its light merging with theirs to form a radiant, pulsating core. But as the sages began to chant, preparing the ritual to restore the deity's heart, one of them stepped forward, their voice heavy with foreboding. "The shards are fragments of immense power," the sage intoned, "but such power cannot be restored without balance. A living sacrifice must be made to complete the ritual." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Alara felt her breath catch, her eyes darting to Kale. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the shards. The sage continued, "The one who offers themselves must do so willingly, their life energy binding the shards together and awakening the deity's heart." A heavy silence settled over the room. Elara's mind churned with a torrent of emotions: fear, resolve, and a deep, aching sorrow. She looked at Kale, searching for answers in his eyes, but found only the same determination that had carried them this far. The choice before them was unthinkable, yet inevitable. Someone would have to give everything to save their world, and as the weight of that truth settled over them, they both knew the decision would not come easily. The flickering light of the shards seemed to dim, as if even they awaited the outcome of this moment. The frost sages stood motionless, their expressions unreadable, as Alara and Kale faced the impossible choice that would define their fate, and the fate of the Frozen Kingdom. Ellara stepped forward, her voice steady but trembling with resolve. "I'll do it," she said, her eyes locked on Kale's. "I'll be the sacrifice. The kingdom needs you, not me." Kale's face darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. "No," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the cold air. "I won't let you. This isn't your burden to bear." The tension between them grew, each refusing to back down, their love for one another fueling their determination to protect the other at any cost. The air around them seemed to crackle with emotion, the weight of their choices pressing down like the icy winds of the Frozen Kingdom itself. Elara's mind raced, searching for another way, a solution that didn't demand a life in exchange for salvation. And then, like a spark igniting in the darkness, it came to her. The shards, their power wasn't just destructive. They were fragments of the deity's essence, raw and untamed, but still connected to the divine. What if they could be shaped, molded into something new? "I have an idea," she said, her voice rising with a mix of hope and desperation. "We don't need a sacrifice. We can use the shards, their energy, their connection to the deity. If we channel that power into a vessel, a sculpture, we could create a new heart. It might work." Kale's brow furrowed, his expression a mixture of doubt and fear. "And if it doesn't?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alara met his gaze, her own filled with determination. "Then I'll bear the consequences. But we have to try, for the kingdom, for us." The plan was daring, almost reckless. To channel the raw energy of the shards into a physical form, to reshape the essence of a god. It was a task that could shatter her mind, her body, even her soul. But Alara stood firm, her resolve unshakable. She knew the risks, yet she also knew the stakes were too high to do nothing. Kale hesitated, torn between his fear for her and the desperate hope that her plan might work. In the end, he nodded, his voice heavy with emotion. "We'll do it together," he said. "But I won't lose you, Ellara, not now, not ever." The moment hung between them, charged with the weight of what was to come. Elara's heart pounded in her chest, not with fear, but with a fierce determination to see this through. The shards glowed faintly in the dim light, their power a silent promise, or a warning. She took a deep breath, ready to take the first step into the unknown, knowing that the fate of the Frozen Kingdom rested on what came next. The frost sages, their eyes glowing with ancient wisdom, nodded solemnly as Alara laid out her plan. The air in the chamber grew still, heavy with anticipation, as they gathered around the sacred sculpture. With a deep breath, Alara stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the shards. The moment her fingers brushed the icy fragments, a surge of energy coursed through her, sharp and electric. She closed her eyes, focusing all her will on channeling that power into the sculpture before her. As the ritual intensified, Elara's mind began to drift. Visions flashed before her, scenes of the kingdom's past, of towering ice spires and roaring blizzards, of a time when the frozen heart pulsed with life. But then the images shifted, showing glimpses of a future shrouded in uncertainty. She saw the kingdom crumbling, its people struggling against an endless winter. The weight of these visions pressed down on her, each one more vivid and overwhelming than the last. Her breath grew shallow, her limbs stiffening as the cold seeped deeper into her body. The strain was unbearable, and she felt herself beginning to falter. Kale, watching from the edge of the circle, saw the toll it was taking on her. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, his own hands glowing with a faint, warm light. He placed them gently on Alara's shoulders, lending her his strength. The connection between them sparked, a flicker of warmth cutting through the icy torrent. Together, they steadied the flow of energy, their combined resolve pushing through the resistance. The sculpture began to shimmer, its surface rippling like liquid ice as the shard's power fused with its core. The chamber filled with a blinding light, and for a moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a soft, resonant hum, the new heart of the deity was complete. The light dimmed, revealing a sculpture that now pulsed with a steady, rhythmic glow. Alara sank to her knees, exhausted but triumphant, as Kale knelt beside her, his own energy spent. Around them, the frost sages murmured in awe, their voices blending with the gentle hum of the newly awakened heart. The ritual had succeeded, but the cost was etched in the weariness of their faces and the frost that clung to their clothes. As the final shard of the deity's heart slid into place, a soft, radiant light pulsed through the frozen kingdom. The air, once sharp with the bite of eternal winter, began to warm ever so slightly. Snowflakes paused mid-fall, then drifted lazily to the ground, no longer driven by the relentless winds. The ice-covered trees creaked and groaned as their frozen shells cracked, revealing the first hints of green beneath. It was as if the land itself exhaled, releasing a breath it had held for centuries. But this moment of renewal came at a cost. Ellara, who had poured every ounce of her strength into the ritual, collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. Her vision blurred, and her breaths came in shallow gasps. Kale, ever watchful, was at her side in an instant, lifting her gently into his arms. His face was a mask of determination, though his eyes betrayed his fear. He carried her through the thawing landscape, his footsteps crunching against the softening snow as the frost sages emerged from their sanctuary to witness the miracle. The sages, their ancient robes shimmering with frost, knelt before Alara as Kale laid her on a bed of moss and lichen. "You have done what no other could," one of them intoned, their voice echoing with reverence. "The frozen kingdom owes you its life," but Alara, though weak, could not find solace in their praise. Her mind wandered to the choices she had made, the lives she had touched, the sacrifices she had witnessed. She thought of the villagers who had trusted her, the friends who had fought beside her, and the countless souls who had endured the endless winter. The weight of it all pressed heavily on her heart, a burden far greater than the physical toll she had endured. As she lay there, her thoughts turned inward. She realized that her journey had not been about power or glory, but about something far deeper. It was about balance, the delicate harmony between strength and compassion, between giving and receiving. True power, she understood, was not in domination or control, but in selflessness and the willingness to act for the greater good. The Frost Sages may have declared her a hero, but Alara knew that her greatest achievement was not the thawing of the winter, but the lessons she had learned along the way. And as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the kingdom, she closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of quiet reflection amidst the stillness of the changing world. As the frost-covered plains of the Frozen Kingdom began to thaw under the gentle warmth of a long-awaited spring, Ellara and Kale made their way back to the village they once called home. The air was filled with a sense of renewal, the scars of battle slowly fading into memory. Villagers lined the streets, their faces alight with gratitude and relief, for the two had become legends in their own right, heroes who had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. Ellara, ever the artist, felt a deep need to honor those who had stood with them during their perilous journey. With her chisel in hand and the Shards' lingering energy pulsing softly within her, she set to work. Day after day, she shaped a towering monument from a block of ice, its surface glistening like starlight. The sculpture depicted not only her and Kael, but also the allies who had risked everything, the wise elder who had guided them, the brave villagers who had fought alongside them, and even the spirits of the frozen north who had whispered secrets of the shard. Each figure was carved with such care that they seemed almost alive, a testament to the bonds forged in the face of winter's wrath. Yet as she worked, Alara couldn't shake the feeling that the shard's power hadn't entirely left her. It hummed faintly in her chest, a reminder of the trials they had endured, and perhaps a warning of what was yet to come. She glanced at Kale, who stood nearby, his steadfast presence a comfort. He had always been her anchor, and now, as he met her gaze, he spoke with quiet determination. Whatever lies ahead, we'll face it together. You're not alone in this, Ellara. Not now, not ever. The villagers, unaware of the shard's lingering influence, celebrated the monument's unveiling with songs and laughter. For them, it marked the end of a dark chapter and the dawn of a brighter future. But for Alara and Kale, it was a bittersweet moment. They had saved their world, yet the journey wasn't truly over. The shard's energy, though subdued, whispered of mysteries still unsolved and challenges yet to come. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village, the two heroes stood side by side, ready to face whatever the future might hold. As the months passed, a fragile peace settled over the Frozen Kingdom, its icy spires glistening under the pale winter sun. But beneath the surface of this newfound tranquility, a storm was brewing. The heart of the winter deity, once a source of life and stability, began to falter. Cracks spread through its crystalline core, each one a harbinger of chaos. The very air grew colder, the winds sharper, as if the land itself sensed the impending danger. Alara and Kale, still weary from their previous trials, knew they could not stand idly by. The kingdom's survival depended on them once more. Their journey to the heart of the Frozen Kingdom was fraught with peril. Blizzards raged with unnatural fury, and the terrain shifted as if alive, testing their resolve at every turn. Yet with each step, Alara felt a growing connection to the land, as though it whispered secrets only she could understand. Kale, ever steadfast, matched her pace, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm. Together they pressed on, driven by a shared purpose that transcended their individual fears. When they finally reached the heart, a vast, cavernous chamber bathed in an eerie blue light, the sight that greeted them was both breathtaking and horrifying. The deity's heart, once radiant and whole, now pulsed erratically, its light flickering like a dying flame. Around it, jagged shards of ice floated ominously, as if suspended in time. The air was heavy with an ancient, almost sentient energy, and Alara could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on her. This was no mere object. It was the soul of the kingdom itself, and it was unraveling. Kale's voice broke the silence, steady but urgent. If the heart fails, the kingdom falls. We have to act now. Ellara nodded, her mind racing. She knew what had to be done, though the thought filled her with both dread and determination. The heart needed a guardian, a living anchor to restore its balance, and deep within her, she felt a pull, a resonance she could not ignore. This was her destiny, her final act of sacrifice. With a deep breath, Alara stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached out to the heart. The moment her fingers brushed its surface, a surge of energy coursed through her, blinding and all-consuming. Kale shouted her name, but his voice was distant, swallowed by the roaring power around her. Alara closed her eyes, surrendering to the force that now bound her to the heart. She felt her essence intertwine with its ancient magic, merging into something greater than herself. The cracks began to mend, the light steadied, and the chamber fell silent once more. When she opened her eyes, the heart glowed with a renewed vitality, its light warm and steady, but Alara was no longer the same. She could feel the pulse of the kingdom within her, its joys and sorrows, its strength and fragility. She had become its guardian, a living embodiment of its spirit. Kale approached, his expression a mix of awe and sorrow. "You've given everything," he said softly. Ellara smiled, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "It's not a loss," she replied. "It's a new beginning. The kingdom will endure, and so will we." In that moment, the Frozen Kingdom found its balance once more, not through force or conquest, but through the selfless act of one who chose to bear its weight. And as the winds calmed and the skies cleared, the people of the kingdom whispered her name with reverence, a name that would echo through the ages, a testament to the power of sacrifice and the enduring strength of the human spirit. As the final chapter of Elara's tale unfolds, her sacrifice becomes the cornerstone of the Frozen Kingdom's rebirth. No longer just a humble ice sculptor, she ascends into legend, her essence woven into the very fabric of the land. Every snowfall carries her touch, each icy breeze whispers her name, and the shimmering frost that blankets the kingdom glows with the memory of her courage. Elara's transformation is not just a moment of loss, it's a beginning, a story that will echo through the ages. Kale, her steadfast companion, steps into a new role as the kingdom's guardian. With a heart heavy with grief, but fueled by purpose, He dedicates his life to protecting the people Ellara loved so dearly. Under his watch, the Frozen Kingdom flourishes, its icy spires and frost-kissed valleys becoming symbols of resilience and hope. The people, once gripped by fear, now live in peace, their gratitude for Elara's sacrifice etched into every tradition, every song, every story told by the hearth. Yet, even as the kingdom prospers, there are moments when the weight of Elara's absence is felt most deeply. On the quietest nights, when the stars hang low and the wind carries a haunting melody, Kale pauses. In those fleeting seconds, he hears her voice, soft, familiar, and impossibly alive. It's a whisper on the breeze, a gentle reminder that Elara's spirit has not truly left. She is there, in the icy peaks, the frozen rivers, and the endless expanse of snow. Her presence lingers, a silent protector, watching over the land she gave everything to save. The Frozen Kingdom endures, not just as a place of ice and winter, but as a testament to love, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds that define us. Elara's story lives on, not only in the hearts of its people, but in the very air they breathe. And as the years pass, her legend grows, a reminder that even in the coldest of times, warmth and hope can be found in the legacy of those who dare to give all.